admit it, you were hoping for a Star Wars trailer, weren't you, actually? Right? All right. Thank you so much for sticking around with us to the end of the day. I'm so happy to be in the position of moderating our last panel, which is about educating the next generation, and I want to acknowledge the support of Raise Your Hand Texas, the Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Consortium, and the Powell Foundation, and Educate Texas, generously supporting the program you're about to hear, as well as any of you who are members of the Texas Tribune. This is, in fact, our last panel of the day, and so let me say again how much we appreciate you being here, the generosity of Houston downtown, and everybody who worked really hard on this program, particularly Agnes Varnum, Jessica Weaver, Charlie Rezick, April Hinkle of the Texas Tribune, along with our AV crew. Please give the Tribune folks a hand and acknowledge their hard work as well. I'm so pleased to introduce four distinguished panelists with whom I will talk about big issues related to public and higher education, and in particular educating the urban student population, increasing urban student population of this state. On my left is my old friend Colette Pierce Burnette, President and CEO of Huston-Tillotson University, a 67-year-old HBCU in Austin with 144. Where did it get 67 in here? 144. But when was the combination of the two? Yeah, okay.
Older than the University of Texas.
I'm fact-checking in real time, 144, with just over 1,100 students. That's correct. Okay, that one's right. Prior to her arrival in July of 2015, Dr. Pierce Burnette had held leadership positions at higher ed institutions all over the country, most recently at Pierce College in Washington State, where she was interim president. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, she has an undergraduate degree from The Ohio State University, a master's from Georgia College, and a Doctor of Education degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Pedro Martinez is in his fifth year as superintendent of the San Antonio Independent School District, which serves just under 50,000 students across 90 schools. He previously served as superintendent in residence for the Nevada Department of Education and as superintendent of the Washoe County School District in Nevada. He's a native of Mexico. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MBA from DePaul University. Joe May has been chancellor of the Dallas County Community College District since February 2014, presiding over a system of 7 colleges, educating more than 86,000 students. He previously led the Louisiana Community and Technical College System and the Colorado Community College System. He is a native of East Texas. He has undergraduate and master's degrees from Stephen F. Austin State University and a PhD from Texas A&M University Commerce. Finally, Christina Meir teaches gifted and talented students in the 4th and 5th grade at Caldwell Elementary School in the El Paso Independent School District. She is the campus's UIL coordinator and the team manager for an award-winning Destination Imagination team, and she spent 5 years as Caldwell's gifted and talented campus coordinator. She was named Campus Teacher of the Year for 2015-2016. She's an El Paso native and a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Please welcome our distinguished panelists. Give them a big...
Thank you.
So good to be with all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Mr. May, let me start with you. I'm going to ask this of all 4 of our panelists. Give us the lay of the land from the community college perspective. You wake up every day, you think about certain things, you lay awake at night thinking about certain things, keep you up. The challenges and the opportunities. What is on your agenda? What's in your viewfinder? What are you thinking about from a lay of the land for community colleges standpoint right now?
Sure. Well, I can tell you what we think about in Dallas. We really start with a real concern about what's going on in the community, especially when we have one aspect of our community that's booming, having grown by about 1 million people since 2011, with 330 jobs a day being created in the area, and at the same time, one of the fastest rising poverty rates in the country.
Right.
And people being left out of that economy, and income disparity growing at an unprecedented rate with a declining median family income. That keeps me awake at night.
Yeah. Dr. Pierce Burnette, you're in a different situation in that you're on the private side of the higher education conversation. You're in a small institution. If I had the president of a big public university here, it might be a different answer. But in your case, running an incredibly old HBCU, we're going to talk about that 100 times today. What do you think about when you're awake at night, unable to sleep? What are the things on your mind?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Any opportunity you have to talk about education and how it serves as the great equalizer and how we need to bring it to people's attention is a pleasure and a gift. Actually, we're 144 years old, and one of our talking points is that we're older than the University of Texas at Austin. We've been doing this a very long time.
In your face, UT. That's exactly right.
Bam.
Yeah.
What keeps me up at night is affordability, period. Huston-Tillotson is a historically black college, and 98% of my students are on some form of aid.
Wow.
70+ % are Pell eligible. 45% are still first generation. So if you're Pell eligible, you make approximately $30,000 family income.
Yep.
Our tuition, which is relatively low for privates in Texas, is $20,000.
That's the rack rate. That's what somebody coming in the door would pay if they pay 100% unaided.
Exactly.
So really, Dr. Pierce-Burnette, your answer is a version of Dr. May's answer, which is poverty. I'm concerned about disparity.
Disparity and growing disparity. The stratification. Higher education is supposed to close the gap.
Right.
It's supposed to make you socially upwardly mobile. And we're in a position in the nation where it is widening the gap.
Yeah.
And we're also in a nation where investment in education is seen as something, it's a private benefit as opposed to a public good.
Right.
And it started as a public good. We still need education for the public good. And for the state of Texas to reach its 60 by 30, 60% of the population to be educated by 2030, it's not going to reach that mathematically unless you educate more poor and black and brown children.
And of course, just to put a cap on that, there's another component of the 60 by 30 plan that also tries to address the question of student debt, which ties directly back to the affordability question and the question of whether we're investing enough on the front end of higher ed. Superintendent Martinez, San Antonio is not alone in this respect, but I believe 1 out of every 4 residents of the city is living in poverty, right?
That's right.
You have a very high poverty rate. Is that what you think about as well, similar to Dr. May and Dr. Pierce-Burnette?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the unique things about San Antonio is it's a wonderful city, but the city grew through annexation. And so we're the original district of the city. As they annexed over the last 50 years, eventually became, the 16 school districts are within the city of San Antonio. San Antonio is also known as the city with the most, with the highest disparity in terms of wealth and poverty in the country. My children in my district, for example, the median income is $30,000. The 35,000 of the almost 49,000 students qualify for Medicaid. And you can imagine how poor you have to be to qualify for that.
What percentage are on, I'm just curious about free and reduced lunch, because we know that free and reduced lunch in the state of Texas, about 60% of the 5.5 million kids enrolled.
So Joe, we're at 90%. We're the highest of any of the urban districts in the state of Texas.
90% on free and reduced lunch. How can that not be? I'm just thinking about what shape, in everybody's cases, what shape your kids arrive at school in at the beginning of the day. Are they set up for success by the conditions outside of the classroom, whether it's public ed or higher ed? And I have to believe, Superintendent, that the conditions are difficult at best.
So one of the things that we know, Joe, regardless of what city you're in, when you live in poverty, you're at least 2 grade levels below coming into kindergarten.
Right.
And so for us, the biggest challenge is it's almost the entire district.
Yeah.
And so the challenge and of course our accountability systems generally still try to, they evaluate everybody very similarly. And
right.
So the challenge is always for us, we're in the beginning of probably the biggest turnaround of any urban district in the country because of our density of poverty. And we're still early, but 4 years ago, we were an F district with 35,000 seats that were IR or F seats. We've cut that number down to just under 8,000. Still have a ways to go.
But you've come a long way, though.
But still a ways to go. But poverty, we see the challenges of poverty every single day, and my teachers face that every day.
Right. And Ms. Muir, you're a ray of hope, right? You're leading gifted and talented kids in El Paso, extraordinary kids, I'm sure, but they're outliers, are they not? The challenges for so many teachers, so many people in your position in that district are pretty enormous.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having me here. It's so good to be here.
We need to have teachers in this kind of a conversation,
absolutely,
honestly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I actually will tell you that the El Paso public education story is quite unique. And I'd like to share only because we talked right now about the statistics and poverty and so forth. My campus, I feel, is doing it right. We have a student body that is 93% Hispanic with 97% economically disadvantaged. But here is what I feel truly makes a difference. With a campus like that, it's kind of uncommon to have, in this case for us, we have a current standing of an A from TEA, and that's a tremendously hard rating to get. But great things are happening in the classroom. Yes, I am in the trenches, but it's really ultimately the support that comes from beyond the classroom. It's really the fact that we're treated as professionals in my area, and we also follow like a community schools framework. And to me, that makes all the difference, because what we're looking at is the whole child, and that's what is making high quality education in my area really a strong point. What I mean by that, Evan, is that I get to see firsthand the benefits of wraparound services, because at our campus we not only have a full-time school counselor, but we employ a full-time social worker, and she's on campus 100%. And then we tap into Parks and Recreation, which then allows our parents to have that opportunity to have their kids register for after-school care.
So it's not enough to just be a teacher or just be a
No,
superintendent.
we need the support from beyond.
Superintendent, you are having to play roles in public education that are much larger than simply educating.
Yes, sir. You know, what's fascinating to me is how our schools now have food pantries in our schools, because we know our children, you know, when they go home for the weekend, many of them suffer from food insecurity. We have closets. All my schools have uniforms because we don't want children to have to worry about how they're going to dress and how they're going to be perceived. And so we now are starting to put washing machines, because we see students where the uniforms are dirty and we don't even ask questions. We just say, here's a new uniform. Let us, you know, and we wash the uniforms. And so we're doing that so that our teachers can really focus on instruction, and so that we're starting to at least try to deal with some of these challenges that are coming from outside of the classroom.
Yeah. It's traditional for public ed to be in that realm, but Dr. Pierce-Burnette, higher ed also is having to spend a lot more time thinking about life outside the classroom, right?
Right, because students bring their lives with them. We think of college readiness as your SAT, ACT score, and your GPA. And it's so much more than that. It's how you critically think, your self-efficacy, your time management, the way you manage your money, and those things come from exposure and opportunities.
Yeah.
And you find that children who come from low-income situations don't have those kind of opportunities, because those opportunities sometimes cost money.
Yeah.
And one thing I really want to bring out, and you touched on it, is poverty does not equate with intelligence. And when we try to address many of these problems, we think mostly like we need to save these children. And they do not need to be saved. They need good books and good teachers and good facilities.
Yeah, that's right. Dr. May, you, as you called out, are living in a city, Dallas, that is fast-growing, dynamically changing, right? I think in every case here, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, El Paso, you've got a city where the Anglo population is below the majority, in some cases well below the majority, and you've got cities that are very fast growing. Would we be having a different conversation today if this were, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago? Do the circumstances on the ground today materially determine the way you approach this? Before the city was growing so quickly and before diversity was such a fact of life in all these communities?
I think the answer is probably yes in some ways, but if you go back even 50 years ago to the creation of the Dallas County Community College District, I talked to one of the original founders who went door to door to do the petition, and the very things they cared about are the same things we're caring about now. And it was, how do we create opportunity for people who had advantage? Now, the difference is, in 1965, only about 22% of the Dallas population needed a post-secondary degree.
Yeah.
That's what's really changed. And when we look today, we just looked at 122,000 jobs created over the past year in the county. 65% require a post-secondary credential today. That's absolutely required to get those jobs. 32% baccalaureate or higher, 33% something less than the baccalaureate but more than a high school diploma. And that's the real driver. Then you have the pressure on the employer side that needs to grow the economy, because there's only two ways to grow GDP: increase the size of the workforce or the productivity of the workforce, and that takes people going through the education system today. So I think that's what's the real change that's out there. We've always cared about individuals, but there was this certain belief that I don't know, we had this crazy idea that part of that experience going through the minefield to get the degree was somehow of value. Well, all that's done is leave people behind that we now need to really help and prop up in many, many different ways.
And focus on the end goal. I mean, I'm hearing you say that you're as much focused on creating future workers, the future workforce of Texas, as you are creating future citizens.
But it goes hand in hand.
Right.
If individuals are able to get the good-paying jobs that allow them to meet the needs of their family,
Right.
To take part in their community, to support their local church and activities that are there, then that is good for all of us. It really is not just about the needs of the employer. It really is about the success of the entire community and how we help that happen.
Right. Ms. Meir, I've heard Commissioner Morath, the head of the TEA, say that it is the job of public education to create these future stewards of the republic or something, right? He sees the responsibility of public education as connected really to the people who are going to take the baton from all of us, right?
Well,
is that how you think about the goals every day when you come in and you teach those kids?
Well, no, but I think it is important to see the end goal. And so we are in the classrooms looking at developing the creative thinking, the learner who is always willing to learn. You had mentioned GT. Yes, that is my work and my advocacy. And we cannot forget those kids. They cannot fall through the cracks, because we hear a lot about closing the achievement gap. And that is very critical, but I think that closing the excellence gap is something that we also need to focus on, looking at the upper end of the spectrum, because those are your critical thinkers. Those are the ones who are going to contribute immensely to the future of the Texas workforce.
Superintendent, what is the goal that you think about with the kids at all levels of the school district? What are you trying to achieve
So
if you successfully educate these kids?
So, and we're still early in our journey. I'm in my 5th year. I've told the community I see this as at least a 10-year plan.
Yep.
That we will have not only our children graduating, right now we're at 85%, which is increased, but we want to go to over 90%, close to 100 as possible. What I really want is what Joe stated earlier, is I want my children to have a shot at the jobs in San Antonio.
Yep.
One of the challenges that I see, our city's growing, companies are coming in, and the children that are born in San Antonio, grown up in San Antonio, are not getting the same opportunities because we're bringing in so much labor from outside of San Antonio. Sometimes from other cities in Texas, sometimes outside of Texas. And so what I want is our district to put children in a position where they have a shot at those opportunities.
What does it take? I mean, you make a great point.
It's what Joe said. The fact is, and I love the fact that they have this current data in Dallas. 65% of our children will need something beyond a high school diploma. For all the families that always ask me about career tech, so we're building schools right now where our children are getting 30 college hours of credit, where they're getting certificates. They're aligned to healthcare, they're aligned to technology, to all the fastest growing industries. And so we're transforming the high schools into that. Again, it's a process, but what I tell our students is these jobs that are coming, they're not for somebody else, they're for you. And you have to feel confident that you can claim them. Because we've been so used to in San Antonio, I can't speak to the other cities, of importing so much labor.
Yep.
That, the message, in essence, what we've done is, like I said, is children have grown up there, have not had the same opportunities.
I like the idea that you're drilling into them, that it's not so much about skills at the beginning, it's about mindset, right? Before you acquire those skills. Dr. Pierce Burnette, obviously, again, you're in a different situation than community college district might be or a public university, but what is the goal for your students? You describe them, again, in many cases as first in their family or first in their generation to go to school. What is completion enough, or is there a goal beyond that?
The goal is for them to achieve upward mobility, however they define it.
Right.
And particularly if I'm the first in my family to go to college, I'm going to set a tone. I'm not of the ilk that young people don't need some kind of post-secondary education. If you're an African-American male, you got to have something after high school, realistically, for you to be able to
So the people who
elevate your
say
life.
college is not for everybody, you're not buying that necessarily.
That, if I ask them, is college necessary for your child, the question becomes very different.
Right.
So I say college is not for everybody, but then when someone asks me about your child, it's a different response.
Right.
So that's a code word for saying college is not for them.
Yep.
And I don't subscribe to that at all. Because if I hadn't gone to anything after high school, I wouldn't be sitting in Austin, Texas, serving Huston-Tillotson. My education is what gave me those opportunities.
Right.
So, back to your question, Mike, the end goal for us is to be able to lift communities.
Yep.
And we instill in our students, there's no language of lack on our campus. Young people go through their entire matriculation, particularly children of color, black and brown children, of what they're told they cannot do and what they are not. And that does not instill in them that you can do anything that you put your heart to, and with a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
So irrespective of the color of your skin, you have to work harder, unfortunately. I also don't think that we can ignore the history of education in this nation. I don't think that we've been open to educating all. The GI Bill was what educated most of the white middle class. And the GI Bill was looked as a leg up. Mm-hmm. But Pell, entitlements, free lunch are looked at as a hand-me-down.
Or as a handout, right?
As a handout or a hand-me-down.
Right.
And until we shift that paradigm in this nation to say that these are not handouts or hand-me-downs, this is not a negative thing, but this is a leg up to give you an opportunity by nature of what you have not received because of your zip code.
Yep.
We will not make change in the nation when it comes to education.
Well, this is a conference about, or a symposium about urban Texas, and we're talking in theory about urban education, which is why we have 4 urban legislators. I wonder, though, if this conversation would be different if I had your rural equivalents up here. Would the criteria for success, would the things you felt you needed that you didn't have, or the goals that you were working toward be different, Dr. Pierce Burnette, if I had the president of Prairie View here, an HBCU in a more rural, non-urban area, or are you trying to accomplish the same things?
I believe strongly we're trying to accomplish the same things.
Right.
Because in most cases, we're serving the same audience.
But does being in an urban environment or serving an urban student population make your job harder?
My expenses are higher.
Your expenses are higher.
So in that case, yes, because
Right.
I have the same utility rates as my sister institutions right there in Austin.
Right. And you're also in a part of Austin, you and I have talked about this, you're in a part of Austin that is rapidly gentrifying and doing its very best to push you guys out.
And that's not going to happen.
Right.
We're a reminder
Yeah.
of that part of Austin. One thing I want to say,
Yeah.
the question about urban education, I think the real question is why are we as a nation, why are urban children receiving subpar education as opposed to suburban children or parochial children, children who
Right.
go to parochial schools or private schools? That's
Right.
the real question.
And what's your theory as to the answer to that?
It's back to the history of this nation. I was in a meeting with E3 Alliance, and I was actually getting sad because every chart, all the data, the black kids were the lowest bar. And I started seemed very frustrated. So I sent my son, who writes about education, a text message during the meeting, and I said, this is making me so sad. And he said, you cannot forget that it was just 70 years ago that we were able to even have an education.
Right.
So you can't ignore that and then think that we're supposed to just jump into the game at the same rate as everyone else. And that takes resources and heart to be able to address that.
So really, I got to stay with Dr. Pierce Burnette for a second. So you really think that race is as much of a determinant of the ability that you all have to do your jobs and the difficulties that may be put in your way as poverty is?
Yeah, I think it's something that we ignore.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about, these are code words when we talk about urban education. And I think we continue to make decisions that are...
Urban means non-white.
It means non-white.
Right.
And I think as long as we continue to make legislative decisions that systemically impact, I don't think anyone's intentionally trying to be, but we continue to perpetuate a system that has an underlying current of being biased.
Yeah.
When we integrated, we laid off several African American teachers, and we never recover from that. So now to be able to generate more African American and more Hispanic, more teachers of color to teach children of color. And there's data that shows in my K-12 matriculation, if I don't see at least one teacher who looks like me, the chances of my succeeding and being able to matriculate into community college or university is lower.
Yeah.
Could I
So
follow up?
there's data that shows that.
Yeah,
I'm
please.
sorry, could I follow
Sure,
up on that?
sure.
And really, just kind of like a flip side of that, I'm glad to see that there's efforts that, for example, again, in the gifted and talented area, TAGIT, which is the Texas Association of Gifted and Talented, has begun to sponsor yearly, if not twice a year, conferences called Giftedness Plus Equity. And I'm seeing some of that work being done where we're working at building school cultures where, for example, some of the teacher biases are being eliminated at the time of selecting students of color, ELLs, and students of poverty for testing. And then there's a lot of districts, and this is where we have to come on board as far as districts and campuses, to use a identification test that has a nonverbal component, because that can then benefit the ELLs and students of color and poverty
Yep.
when it comes to the holistic selection of these students.
Yeah.
And with our population reflecting the increase in Hispanics, I think that parallel rise in identification of these students needs to continue.
Superintendent, I like what Dr. Pierce, thank you. That's an excellent point on the GT stuff. I want to go back to what Dr. Pierce Burnette said, Superintendent, about the importance of students seeing people in the classroom who look like them
Yeah.
as a way to give them kind of a way into the conversation and a way up through the. This is a factor for you as well?
Absolutely. So 97% of my children are Latinx and African American. I am proud that almost 3/4 of my teachers and school leaders are leaders of color. And
And even though you're not at the same percentage as the student body, that's actually a very high percentage
It's-
compared to
it's-
most school districts,
it's
right?
one of the highest in the
One of the
country.
highest in the state.
And
Right.
one of the highest in the country. And of course, the goal is making sure that we're keeping our top teachers, we're keeping our top leaders. And so for us, it's not only having professionals that look like them, but it's professionals that also, where we're training them around culture sensitivity, where we're training them on the best practice. I have an all-boys school that starts in 4th grade, because when boys are tested in 3rd grade, all of a sudden this cute young man that tends to be very active, all of a sudden is a trouble child. All of a sudden is a child that's being sent to the principal's office and being referred
Right.
for discipline. So they start in 4th grade. It's been open 4 years. It's one of my top schools.
Yeah.
And those boys, it was so successful that I'm having them expand into high school grades.
Yeah.
And so for us, we're learning these strategies that are very tied to both poverty and race. Dr. Drennan's in the audience. She does a very interesting history of San Antonio, where we talk about redlining. How in my district, if you were African American or Latino, you only could live in certain parts of the city, and you couldn't even get funding for your house. And so
Right.
you were destined to poverty. And so these are the generations of children that we're teaching in our district, that have this generational poverty that is very, very entrenched. And we said, look, it's not an excuse. We just have to understand it, though, so that, again,
Right.
we can shape our strategies.
Dr. May, what we said it's 86,000, is that right? 86,000 students among the 7 colleges in.
We actually have about 155,000, but about 82,000 are on the credit. The rest are apprenticeship, workforce, and
Okay.
other types of.
The racial makeup of your student body is what?
Sure. We're right now, we sit at about 48% Latino students are there. We are at about 35% African American in the
Right. So you're north of
remaining Asian and
80% students of color.
White. That's correct.
In a state that is 57% students of color as we sit here today. So you're actually ahead as far as that
We
goes.
are. When we
Yeah.
look at this year's 8th graders in Dallas Independent School District, they're
Right.
70% Hispanic, 15% African American, and 10% white.
Yeah, I'm amazed whenever I quote the statistic that the Anglo enrollment in the Dallas Independent School District today is below 5%, right? Just to give you an indication of how the younger Texans are leading the way in terms of the rapid diversity or diversifying of our population. So how does the component of race factor into the way that you think about your opportunity and responsibility.
Well,
at
I
the-
can't disagree with anything that's been said.
Yeah.
It really is in terms of how we understand both the cultural barriers, the reality of what students
Yes.
are facing, bringing individuals not only into our classroom, but who are engaging with them and creating trusted roles
Right.
within the institution.
And recruitment of faculty and non-instructional staff, just as important for you in terms of reflecting the student population.
Yeah, there's the way we promote higher education, frankly, works against people of color and people coming out of the lowest socioeconomic
Explain that.
sector. So we promote, most of higher ed is promoted on brand and lifestyle. Lifestyle when you're in college, lifestyle when you're out of college. That sounds expensive, and it's interpreted by individuals, particularly of color, that it's too expensive for them. So they start telling their children at an early age, we can't afford to send you to college. They don't understand Pell Grants, federal financial aid, scholarships, other
Right.
things that are out there. They believe it's out of reach, and that message is hard to turn around. I was thinking of a student just as I was talking here, Jose Alvarez, class president, top of the class at Grand Prairie High, but wasn't going to college because that was the message that he had heard. And we also know that when you're coming out of the lowest socioeconomic quartile, which is virtually all people of color that we work with today, that only one thing correlates with whether or not you go to college. It's not grades, it's not rank in class, it's whether or not you complete the FAFSA during the senior year. If you do, you're going to college. If you don't, you won't. Well, that means getting into taxes, that means filling out forms, that means having to trust.
It means even
governments.
knowing what the FAFSA is,
Yeah, that's
right? I
correct.
mean,
That's correct.
just awareness of it is probably 3/4 of this, right?
Well, and if you don't trust government, if you have others, then you're very
Right.
unlikely to complete that.
Superintendent, let me ask you about the money part of this, because as we know, money doesn't solve all problems, but it's easier to solve problems if you have money than if you don't. The discussion that we had last night with our legislators, including your fellow Santonian Representative Bernal, who was instrumental in the crafting of legislation that now is going to put $11.6 billion into public education in Texas, much of it into the classroom, some of it into buying down property taxes. Is it as simple as you needed more money per student in order for you to achieve your ambitious goals? Does that money really ultimately matter to your ability to educate your challenging urban student population?
It absolutely matters. Every teacher that you'll interview in Texas, whether they're in the wealthiest district or the poorest district in the state, will tell you it matters.
Raising the allotment per student matters.
Not only raising the allotment, but to put context, Texas was 42 out of 50 states in state funding with the fastest growing poverty rate in the country.
Right.
At scale, it's the second largest state in the country with 5.5 million students, and so
Right.
and the highest uninsured population in the country, and so
Right. And the
those
urban
things-
areas, as we've said several times today, disproportionately more uninsured than the population of the main.
And so
Right.
we see that in our schools. I mean, one of the things that I always have to remind people is that K-12, we have our children at least 8 to 10 hours per day. And we're feeding them, we're transporting them. In my case, we're providing them uniforms. I mean, we're providing health care to them. I've opened up 2 clinics in my district because I just got tired of just waiting for somebody else to provide some of these
You're
services.
effectively the second family for these kids.
And so when you don't have the resources, and you really send a message to our teachers,
Right.
well, sorry, the money isn't there. Too bad. You got to do the best you can. And then you wonder why we have large gaps. Then you wonder why the wealthiest, the wealth disparity is growing faster than ever in our country.
So the state taking on a larger share of the funding of public education, up from the mid-30s now to the mid to high 40s after this legislation, it matters to you.
It does, and I think it's a great start. And so I'm also very worried, Eric, about what you said earlier, is how do we sustain it? Because I think it's the beginning of the investment. It's not the
You only budget for
investment.
2 years. There's no guarantee that's going to continue. In your case, Ms. Meir, the teacher pay raise that was factored into this legislation for you and your colleagues teaching these kiddos, this matters.
Well, sure, it matters. I think we're very grateful. I want to take the time to thank anybody in the audience who worked on the school finance reform and the passing of HB3. It is resources that we're ultimately looking at. I know you mentioned the teacher pay, but really it's being in the classroom and having to work with limited resources. And here we're having, especially if you're coming, like I am, from a campus of low socioeconomic disadvantaged families, many of my students, lack the real life rich experiences. Many of them lack the extracurricular sports and arts opportunities. So if they don't get it at school with those limited resources, where do they get it?
Well, you're very nice to take the conversation around money off of teacher pay, but I want to bring it back to teacher pay. And the reason I want to bring it back to teacher pay is that we know that a ridiculously low percentage of kids graduating from high school these days say they want to be a teacher, and in part that's because they don't believe that they can earn a livable wage
I'll take that.
as
I'll take it on.
teachers. And so the increase in the base pay of teachers, the way that the legislature did it, in part at least, creates potentially a path for more people to enter the profession, right?
So it's a resounding yes. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But it's high time that we actually professionalize the profession. That's
Right.
really where it lies. I think that
Yeah.
as teachers, I know myself and my colleagues, that really is what matters a lot. I know that we talk about teachers, do it for the cause, not the applause and money-wise and
Yeah,
so forth.
but the cause
But-
doesn't pay the light bill.
Right, and I'll tell you one thing. Teacher voices are rising, and lucky for me, for example, I've been able to see and partake in teacher platforms where our voice is being heard,
Yeah.
and then our vote is our voice. And so I'm not surprised that that's why in this past legislative session, public education was a priority.
Right, because the election in 2018 was a different kind of election than we've had in a while. I want to ask Dr. May and Dr. Pierce Burnette about the funding of higher education, though through kind of a different, obviously the different situations, it's a different deal. We know, Dr. May, that community colleges represent more than half the higher ed enrollment in the state of Texas. A lot of the attention is on the funding of the 4 years. And in fact, yesterday we published a story in the Texas Tribune that the University of Texas system had agreed to an increase of 2.5% or so in tuition across their campuses next year and the year after that. And of course, people go, wow, they're increasing tuition. That's amazing. But the fact is, you have a conversation at the community college level about resources available from the legislature. Sure. You're as interested in not passing off the cost of higher ed onto the backs of families and students as the 4 years are, right?
Well,
Do you have enough? Because the percentage of funding that the state takes on of higher ed has been no better than the funding of public ed.
well, that's absolutely correct. And there are very different funding models for four-year public
And the community
colleges as such. And Frank, even within community colleges, as you know, I've run two state systems, which means they tend to be uniformed across the state. In Texas, we've identified 6 distinct funding models for community colleges that exist because it's a mixture of local property tax, state funding, and tuition. Now, in our DNA is the goal to keep tuition for students as low as possible.
Right.
Therefore, Pell Grants will go further and cover the tuition that's there. In fact, we're on average 3rd lowest in the nation, behind California and New Mexico today. But that is not true at every location. When you have a college like Blinn that only gets 1% of its funding from local property tax, and one like Dallas that gets 62% of the funding.
62%.
62%.
Right.
So that gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of how we use dollars. We have institutions, and I'll put Dallas in this category, that are in the position to do what we do because we have resources, not to get resources.
Right, but we had Senator Betancourt here last night, who, as you know, was the architect of the reform of property taxes. And I remember during the legislative session when there was a discussion of limiting the ability of local elected officials and local taxing districts to raise property taxes year over year above a certain point, it was the community colleges that stepped up and said, wait a minute, if you do this, we may need to raise tuition rates because you're limiting our access to those dollars we need, and that's going to price some kids and some families out of being able to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The tuition would have gone up. But
Yeah.
we've not raised tuition in the past 5 years.
Not in the last 5
Not
years.
in the last 5 to keep it affordable.
Right.
And to get more students. And it's worked. We're up 17.2% over the last 2 years in enrollment. And I think that's part of it, but it's also a lot of the other work that we've done with wraparound services.
And when it comes to a legislative session, Dr. May, you are among the other community college leaders or at the legislature saying we do need more resources and we can stretch those resources a long way, but we can't accomplish our goals unless you adequately fund
Well, I
us.
went even further than that. What I said was that when you look at our 3 sources of funding,
Right.
Tuition, local property tax, and state funding. The state funding is the lowest and the most unreliable piece of our funding.
Right. It just seems like the opposite of what it ought to be. It's remarkable. So, Dr. Pierce Burnette, you are not a public institution. So the conversation about the legislature may be charming, but ultimately it's not relevant to the way that you do what you do. So how do you think about having adequate resources to do? I visited you for lunch a couple of years ago on your great campus, and you said to me one of the challenges we have, I think it was a air conditioning in a gym. Is that what your gym is not air conditioned? Now, again, as you've pointed out correctly, you've been in business for 8,000 years, right? And after 8,000 years in business,
8,144.
8,144. And as you point out, you do not have air conditioning in your gym. I mean, you guys are living with facilities that are far below what you think they would need to be. Right.
The first question you asked is what keeps us up at night?
Yeah.
And I wrestle with that 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And it's, you can't get ahead because you can't get ahead. That's what systemic challenges are.
Right.
So we have the special sauce, clearly, because we've been doing this a good little while. We know what to do with these young people. And we need resources to be able to push them through graduation. So when I read that $130+ million is given to my sister institution for a basketball arena, that
By one donor.
by one donor, that troubles me. $130 million is transformational to a campus like
If
Huston-Tillotson.
if that donor, let's call out the generosity of that donor, not to call him out in a negative way, but the Moody Foundation, Ross Moody and the Moody family, which just gave $130 million for the new basketball arena at the University of Texas. If they had given $129 million and instead had given $1 million to Huston-Tillotson, would you be able to air condition your gym for $1 million?
I sure would.
Yeah. Would you have some money left over possibly to give scholarships?
I sure would.
You would.
And we struggle with tuition increases because my students are at a price point. So we raised our tuition 2.5% reluctantly after 3 years of not raising tuition at all, but our expenses continue to go up. So unless we get, and we're not a charity, we're an investment in the future.
Right.
And once we shift that paradigm that we need to, because yes, you're right, resources don't solve everything. And I was really pleased about what the superintendent said about the things that he's doing in his district. Those things are coming from people with lived experiences. So it comes in with people with lived experiences making decisions, those closest to the point, pain
Right.
being closest to the decision making, in addition to the resources to implement those things that they know work in their campuses.
Just out of curiosity, before we're going to do one last question before we go to the audience. What would it cost you to air condition that gym in Huston-Tillotson?
It's actually $2.5 million, but you give me $1 million. and
Oh,
you make
okay.
it
So,
work.
I see. Okay, it's more complicated
You give
than
me
the
a- yeah, you
conversation
give-
we
but you
had.
give me $1 million
But if
and we'll
anybody
make it
is
work.
listening and they have $2.5 million just sitting around, think of the good you could do. If you
Yeah.
raise $2.5 million off this live stream, you have to name it the Texas Tribune Gymnasium.
Call me. Like
Seriously.
they say, call me.
We'll work together. Okay. Going from Ms. Meir all the way down to Dr. Pierce Burnette, before we go to the audience, if there's one thing that you could do to affect your ability to do what you do to achieve all your ambitious goals in the realm of urban education, what would it be?
It would
One
be
thing.
the fair, just more fair and high quality written assessments. I am for accountability, but one based on that instead of the high stakes testing that we've been having these past years.
Something we haven't talked about, but a change to the way that you all are judged, held accountable.
Definitely.
Yeah. Although
Right.
you're in
And-
a school
but-
that you said is an A, right? Your school
Well,
got an A by the TE. It sounds like you're doing pretty
but-
well.
Yes, but I mean, we're talking about Texas kids, and so article after article talks about the high stress levels that teachers and students are feeling, and then there's that narrowing of the curriculum.
So even though
That's
they've
not
taken the
good.
number of state-required tests down over the last couple of years, you take it
Well,
down even
we
further.
are at a crossroads or a course correction. The STAR is being worked on, which gets me really excited, having experienced it in the classroom all these years.
Good.
I'm wishing that my voice would be heard on some of the negative, even if they were unintended consequences, you know, especially for our urban kids, our strugglers. Some of them stand a chance of getting stripped of those enrichment opportunities.
You make a good point. Dr. May, what's the one thing you do if you wave your wand over what you're working on?
Sure, and I'm going to put it in context.
Sure.
Because we've dealt, understand our students. We provided now free public transportation for all of them. We put in food pantries. We put in offices to administer staff. We've put in emergency aid. We've provided mental health support and services that are there. But childcare eludes us, and
Childcare.
So it's one that is a real barrier to our students going to school.
Because the
staying in
nature
school,
of your
to
student
be-
population is that it's possibly an older, non-traditional student population and more likely to be in need of
And
that.
the numbers are so large. I mean, you asked what was different about urban as opposed to rural, is scale. That we deal in such larger numbers, which really means that we've got to solve the problems.
Have you priced out what it would cost for you to provide basic child care services to your
I
student
have no
population?
idea what it would cost.
But I presume it's not cheap.
It was not cheap, because the model itself doesn't work. When you are paying basically individuals working in that industry minimum wage or barely above it, but yet that's too expensive for the families, the disconnect there is one, it's a system failure itself that makes this a very difficult
It's almost
problem
cheaper
to solve.
not to go to school. I mean,
And
the
people
shame of it
choose
is,
that
right?
Every day.
You
Every
think
day
about the
people make that
expense, yeah.
choice.
Superintendent, what's the one thing you do?
I would say for us, we're starting to see something really interesting where even with a 90% FRL, we're seeing a disconnect with even my highest density poverty who's starting to outperform other schools.
Yeah.
And really there, it really is about the teachers that not only are skillful, but also again, as we, they believe in our children, they're very culturally sensitive. And so for me, just finding more teachers, keeping our best teachers is our number one goal. And so we can do that for another 5 years. We will be a proof point in the
Good.
country.
I'm going to go to Dr. Pierce Burnette here in a second, but again, if you have questions, please come on down, line up. We're happy to have you ask questions about it. Dr. Pierce Burnette, what was the one thing you do, if you could change one thing?
If I had the magic wand, I would wave into existence a benefactor, parentheses, S, parentheses,
Yeah.
that truly believes in our mission and wants to invest in us and believes strongly that education really is that great equalizer.
And again, being in the private side of higher ed, it does come down to philanthropy, right? Philanthropy makes the difference in a way that maybe is not exactly the same in every other situation.
And we do care about the state because of the Texas Equalization Grant.
So
That's
you're not
very important
completely
to us.
divorced from the conversation what happens at the state. Are they holding up their end on that right now?
Yes.
You're satisfied?
Well, I didn't say that.
My words, not yours. Go right over here, and then we'll go back and forth, sir.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for being here today and discussing such an important issue in urban Texas. Chancellor May, my question touches on a point you made earlier in the conversation regarding the importance of FAFSA in achieving a college education, specifically in regard to at-risk students at risk of being hungry, students at risk of entering the foster care system, at risk of homelessness.
Yep.
These students have a very hard time navigating the college application process. I can think of organizations that are helping in this sphere.
Yep.
Breakthrough.
Breakthrough is a great example, yeah.
But how do we scale that? And how do we scale that quickly enough to impact 30 by 60?
Yeah, that's not really even something we think about, that before you can get kids into school, before you can get them out of school, set the table of opportunity, you've just got to create a more streamlined way to give them.
A couple of things.
Yeah,
And
access.
I can tell you what we've done to change it. If we were a state, we would this year have been the second largest increase in students in the county completing FAFSAs going forward. And we created something we call the Dallas County Promise. Everyone thinks that's a scholarship, but it's not. What it is leveraging Pell dollars, understanding that we will provide the last dollar. And the importance of this is when we go into a school, all means all, so that every single student is guaranteed a free pathway to college, and we cover the last dollar of that. So that takes the doubt out of their mind. And we also, frankly, were behind the effort to require FAFSA completion as graduation rates coming up as well, because we knew that those correlated so highly, not necessarily for students coming out of the top socioeconomic quartile, but absolutely out of the bottom that's there. And so you have to do it at scale, and frankly, that's why we chose the path all means all. This year we're in 57 high schools. We had 12 a year is what we had going forward to make that work.
Good question, thank you. Sir?
I just want to say that I used to work with the president's office over at Houston Community College, and one of the things they did, they would pick a businessman who would serve for 2 to 3 years over a nonprofit foundation, And the purpose of that foundation was to raise money to provide tuition, babysitting, and transportation for young mothers to get back and forth and deal with their babysitting and the whole bit.
Smart.
My point I want to bring up.
Sir.
You were talking earlier about support, and this is to you primarily. There's a difference between support and embracement. Let's look at the Houston market. The urban area of the Houston market has Texas Southern University, the Houston Community College, and HISD. All three of them have suffered bad board members who were convicted or nearly convicted and had to resign their positions because of graft and corruption. Now, when major corporations come to Houston and they say, we're looking at you, Google, Microsoft, Apple, to relocate one of our headquarters here.
Yep.
They all say no, because why should we move here and we have to import our talent? So here we have Texas Southern and U of H right next to each other. I'm doing a film on the life of Congressman Mickey Leland. I'll
Okay.
be short.
Please.
And in the process, I was interviewing a gentleman, and he told me, he said, Bennett, I was close to Governor Clements, and I told him, don't you put no reject Republicans on TSU's board. I don't want nobody who can't be on UT's board and A&M's board.
Right.
You put good people on that board. And so for the first 2 millionaires that ever got on TSU's board, it was a result of a direct effort. But when it comes to support...
Let me just ask you to ask a question.
Yeah, here's my question.
Yes.
When it comes to support, do you think that embracement is better? Because the city of Houston needs to embrace those schools. You can go to any pharmacy in the state of Texas and get generic drugs because of TSU.
You ask a good question.
And so I'm saying...
Dr. Pierce...
The schools don't do that. And so
All right, so let me
why-
move to Dr. Pierce Burnette on this. So we've actually had this conversation. Does Austin embrace Huston-Tillotson? There are a lot of people in parts of Austin who don't even know the Huston-Tillotson is there, and it's been there 400,000 years.
400,000,
144, right? Yeah.
To respond to your question, yes, embracement is definitely, those schools that are more successful are those schools that are embraced by their community. And Austin, I've seen tremendous change, and I'm very pleased with it. Austin has truly embraced Huston-Tillotson as a jewel. We just were, there was a story on MSN.com about how the role we play in diversifying Austin.
But there are still parts of the city, you admit, that do not
that's why I
know
said
enough about the history of the school.
Yet.
Right,
Yeah.
yet.
Okay.
But you acknowledge that that's also a goal for you, a challenge.
That's how the university moved into the space that it was in, because of what was happening in Austin and how people perceived the institution and how it was treated.
Indeed. Hi.
My question is particularly for the higher ed folks. Dr. Pierce Burnette mentioned the 60 by 30 goal, and progress has been slow to reach that goal. What, in your opinion, is the biggest barrier to reaching that goal, and what can be done to address it?
Yeah, Dr. May, did they overshoot the runway on that goal, do you think, or are we going to get there?
Well, when we know 65% of the jobs require some type of post-secondary credential, it's not an overshoot of the job. I could argue it's actually too low for what we see taking place. The question is, how do we get there? I actually think House Bill 3 is providing the right incentives. The challenge for education is we've always tried to do it alone. We don't collaborate well, we don't partner well, and this is a collaborative effort. HB 3 requires, if you go for the PTAC, with Pathways and Technology dollars, which are lucrative, frankly, to your school, you cannot do that alone. You can't do it without a community college, a university, and employers working together. And I think that's the secret sauce as we look at happening. I mean, we're through those partnerships, we've seen dramatic increases not only of college-going rates, but success rates at the same time.
Superintendent.
I actually think Texas will actually show the nation, because what's happening in Dallas, what we're doing in San Antonio, and I hope Houston and Austin also get aggressive on this, is we're redesigning our high schools. We're creating them in such a way where children are getting college credit, so that if they want to go to university, and we're seeing more children than ever going to four-year colleges, but that it becomes that the community college is an amazing partner and is a bridge, whether it's to a job or to a four-year university. that, I think, is something that is unique in Texas, that we can be one of the top in the country.
I've wondered about how we think about public ed and higher ed as in their own silos, when the reality is public ed is higher ed is public ed, it's pre-K through 16 and beyond. It's very much your success is their success is your success.
And we generate the teachers. We create the teachers. Higher
Correct.
education creates
Well,
the
and
teachers.
public ed provides you with kids you hope are prepared to learn, or situated for success, and then you in turn produce teachers that then regenerate the whole thing. Sir.
Hello, thanks. So one of the challenges for lower income socioeconomic status is like probably transportation issues, like getting to school. So I'm hearing about a bicycle curriculum that the TA offers, and what initiatives are you guys working with, like in students who probably have the opportunity with a certain radius of your schools to maybe ride a bike to school? And I'm trying to like build something here, like with my neighborhood schools, because like they're also like low income and they're no more than a mile away. But I'm just curious to know what you guys are implementing in your.
Well, obviously, Dr. May, you called out transportation a couple different times, right? You said free transportation for every one of your students.
We,
Yeah.
several years ago, really looking at the needs of our students, partnered with the Dallas Area Rapid Transit to make up to 123,000 passes available. We have about 35,000 takers. They're good not just to go to college, they're good to use for any purpose. But we've also understand Dallas is in North Texas, you kind of have to have a car to do certain things. I mean, it's a tough one. So in many cases, so we've implemented an emergency aid program because we've seen a flat tire cause a person to drop out of school. So we do support those efforts. We provide up to a $500. It's not a gift. It's just a grant. It's a gift each year if the emergency is such that would cause a person not to complete, and it can be anything related, but it's generally transportation related most of the time.
Superintendent.
What I would love is, we transport 8,000 children, and we are adding actually more bus routes because we even are piloting in certain neighborhoods more door to door, because we're seeing it makes a difference with our children, especially when they get up late or they're feeling sick. But what I really would love is a partnership with the city, stronger around developing more walking paths, biking paths, because as Joe said, I think all the major cities, they are difficult if you don't have a car. And most of my families in public transportation, they do the best they can, but they're still not accessible to the majority of our children.
Right.
So for example, we do SAT all day and we do it junior and senior year because I don't want my children having to worry about on the weekends trying to find the testing centers that are generally not even within our district bounds. And so we just said, no, we're just going to do it in our school. So I would love just a partnership with the cities on something, on issues like this.
Now, El Paso is a city, in my experience, that maybe does not have the culture of public transportation to the same degree that some of the other cities do. Do you run into problems with the families at your school or in your district where transportation becomes a barrier?
No, actually, we don't. And then, of course, I come from an elementary campus, so.
Correct.
Yeah, so I see more of the, it's our community there. But it's really interesting because I was thinking like bike rack at our school. I don't think I've even seen a bike on one of those bike racks. But no, you're right though. El Paso is a different type of story as far as even the facility as
Right.
far as getting around town.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
and-
don't have the transportation network that other cities do.
And then Austin.
The only thing I would add to that is that we need to stay at the table when people are making decisions about transportation. So you need to be in the conversation. Because if you're not in the conversation, that's how decisions are made, where the routes don't go by your institution, you're left on the outside. So we have to continue to be invited in or force your way into these conversations.
Right. I love the fact that we're going to close on a conversation about transportation because it's the last thing on the one hand that you think we'd be talking about on a panel about education. But as with almost everything else we've talked about over the last day or two, it's all intersectional. Everything is about everything else. You can't solve one problem without solving every problem. I'm so happy that we ended today with a great panel. Dr. Pierce Burnette, Superintendent Martinez, Dr. May, Ms. Meir, please give them a big hand. Thank them so much for being here. To all of you who stayed for part of the day, stuck with us the whole time, thank you so much. University of Houston downtown, thank you. Sponsors, thank you. We'll see you again. Appreciate you being here. Thanks a lot.